In the summer of 1956, 10-year-old Betty Sanchez left her family home in a small town in Montana, where everyone believed children were always safe under the daylight sun. Just minutes later, she vanished. No cries for help, no reliable witnesses, no traces leading out of the neighborhood. Police assumed she had wandered off. The family believed she would soon be found, and the community thought it was just a minor accident that would be resolved quickly. The search days passed, then months, years, and the name Betty Sanchez gradually faded into a dusty file. The family was advised to accept that she was gone, or that she would never return. Betty became an unsolved missing child, a void stretching across decades. Then, more than 60 years later, a seemingly meaningless DNA result appeared in a civilian genealogy database. Not in Montana, not in a criminal investigation. And that very detail forced the entire story to be rewritten from the beginning. Before diving deeper into this shocking true story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love journeys into forgotten quests for justice, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. Montana in 1956 still carried the appearance of a peaceful post-war land, where small towns existed in a sense of near absolute safety, where people believed danger was something that only appeared in distant cities mentioned in newspapers, not on the familiar streets where everyone knew each other's names, where children could freely run around from morning till afternoon without adults constantly watching, where house doors were often left unlocked during the day, and summer afternoons passed in simple, predictable repetition, full of trust in the surrounding community. The Sanchez family lived in a working-class neighborhood in Great Falls, Montana, in a modest but tidy home, where daily life followed steady routines that rarely changed. Adults went to work, children went to school, and returned home before dinner, and summers were longer, more relaxed, with less supervision, because everyone believed that here, everything was safe. Betty Sanchez, 10 years old, was the second child in the family, a little girl accustomed to playing alone, moving around the neighborhood by herself, used to being given small errands, like running to a familiar house or the nearby store, accustomed to the absolute trust adults placed in the surrounding environment. Betty's daily routine was nothing special, sleeping in on summer mornings, wandering the neighborhood with other kids at noon, returning home in the afternoon, or stopping by a familiar house before dinner, all within patterns that the Sanchez family and those around them had been familiar with for years. On the day of the incident, Betty was last seen by a specific witness, a close family acquaintance, who regularly interacted with Betty, and was considered absolutely reliable, someone with no reason to be suspicious, and who didn't think they needed to be more vigilant than usual, because long-standing familiarity made everything that happened that day unfold in a state of complacency. This final contact took place in a completely normal context, with no arguments, no clear signs of trouble, just a sequence of familiar actions by a child, in a neighborhood everyone believed was safe, until a subtle abnormality appeared. Not enough to trigger an adult's danger reflex, not enough to make the witness intervene immediately. That abnormality did not resemble a clear threat, but was just a situation slightly out of the ordinary, compared to routine, a small detail that could be explained in many ways. And because of that, the initial reaction from adults and the witness was hesitation, then acceptance, and finally dismissal, based on the belief that nothing bad could happen here. The mistake did not lie in a specific malicious act, but in a chain of small systemic decisions by the entire community, where trust overrode vigilance, where people were used to assuming everything would resolve itself as it always had. As time passed and Betty did not reappear according to her usual routine, anxiety began to spread in the Sanchez family, starting with confusion, then panic when familiar spots around the neighborhood showed no trace of the girl, and quickly turning to hysteria when all reasonable possibilities had been tried without results. The family split up to search spontaneously, calling Betty's name on familiar streets, knocking on neighboring doors, asking anyone who might have seen her that day, while the last witness to interact with Betty could only provide vague information, uncertain about timing, direction of movement, or specific details, because everything had unfolded in a context too ordinary to be remembered precisely. As darkness fell and fear could no longer be suppressed by initial optimism, the Sanchez family was forced to confront the possibility no one wanted to admit, that Betty had not simply wandered off, and in that desperate state, they contacted authorities to report her missing, marking the moment when this family's life was forever divided into before and after Betty Sanchez's disappearance. The Sanchez family's missing person call was received at the local police station, as night had fallen, and most of Great Falls was settling into its familiar quiet, making the event of a child not returning home on time immediately noted as unusual, but not enough to trigger the highest alert level under procedures of the time, because in 1956, cases of children wandering off within residential areas were still often seen as temporary incidents, likely to resolve themselves when the child returned after a few hours. The report was classified at medium priority, with the initial assumption that Betty might have played too long, stayed over at an acquaintance's house, or wandered into a nearby area, and this classification determined the speed and scale of the authorities' response in the first hours. A team of local police was dispatched to the Sanchez family's neighborhood to verify information, record the parents' initial statements, and assess the overall situation, focusing on determining the last time the girl was seen, familiar places she frequented, and a list of people who might have interacted with Betty that day. The deployment followed standard procedure, but without high urgency. No widespread mobilization or inter-area coordination immediately, reflecting the prevailing view at the time, that this was most likely a short-term wandering case. In the rapid information gathering process, police focused on the Sanchez family's accounts, who were in a state of panic and exhaustion after hours of fruitless self-searching, making timelines and event details more approximate than absolutely precise, heavily reliant on memory and subjective perception under psychological stress. Simultaneously, the last witness to interact with Betty was asked to recount the entire sequence of events that day, from the meeting until no longer seeing the girl, but this information also had many gaps, as the initial contact was seen as completely normal, with no strong signs forcing those involved to remember details systematically. The rapid information collection in this phase was synthesizing and preliminary, aimed at creating a general picture of what happened, but that very preliminary nature meant many important details were not delved into deeply from the start, especially the small abnormalities that appeared before Betty vanished. Based on initial data, the investigation team agreed on the main hypothesis that Betty likely left the familiar area out of curiosity or impulse, a hypothesis fitting her age, prior routines, and the social context where children were often given wide freedom of movement. This hypothesis quickly became the foundation for all subsequent decisions, from search scope and resource allocation, to assessing the situation's danger level, and once accepted, it invisibly reduced priority for less common, but potentially more serious possibilities. At the same time, some other investigative directions were considered but eliminated early, including the possibility of Betty encountering harm from a stranger or being taken out of the area by vehicle, as these hypotheses were deemed lacking clear basis without physical evidence, direct witnesses, or significant local precedent. The early elimination of these directions did not stem from negligence, but from an era-specific risk assessment system, where decisions were based on statistical probabilities and past experience, rather than assuming worst-case scenarios. With the wandered-off hypothesis centralized, initial investigative activities revolved around verifying familiar routes, potential child-attracting spots in the area, and close social relationships, while criminal possibilities were pushed to secondary, awaiting clearer signs to activate. It was in this investigation launch phase that the foundation for the entire subsequent process was laid, with decisions that seemed reasonable in the 1956 context, but would later become key factors influencing how the case was viewed, handled, and prioritized over the following years. As Betty Sanchez's disappearance gradually moved from initial urgency into a long, complex investigation full of irreversible turns. Immediately after the initial investigative hypothesis was established, authorities proceeded to search the Sanchez family's living area and nearby locations Betty might have passed through on the day of the incident, starting from the family home, the street in front, familiar paths in the neighborhood, and public spaces where children often gathered in summer, with the goal of reconstructing the girl's possible movement sequence based on routines provided by the family. The search proceeded from near to far, prioritizing areas deemed safe and familiar, before expanding to less frequented spaces, reflecting the strong lingering belief in the investigation team that Betty most likely just wandered off or stopped somewhere within her usual range. Neighboring houses were inquired at, yards checked, small alleys and paths connecting neighborhoods systematically swept. But in the first hours, all efforts yielded no clear traces indicating Betty's specific direction after the last sighting point. It was during this expansion of the search area that a personal item belonging to Betty was discovered at a location not entirely matching initial assumptions, a small detail but enough to make investigators pause and reconsider what they believed to be true. This item, closely tied to Betty's daily life and confirmed by the family as something she always carried when going out, was not on the familiar road home or near places she frequently visited, but appeared in an intermediate area, with no clear reason for Betty to voluntarily stop by if simply playing or wandering. The timing of the item's discovery also raised questions, as it occurred after the family had conducted spontaneous searches in the area without seeing any sign of it, making the possibility of it falling randomly earlier less convincing. Investigators recorded the position, condition and surrounding context of the evidence, cross-referencing with family and witness statements to determine any temporal or spatial matches, but initial results only increased ambiguity rather than providing definitive answers. The investigative value of this evidence quickly became an internal discussion topic, as on one hand it confirmed Betty had been in that area, but on the other, it provided insufficient information to explain why she was there or what happened next, making the evidence both importantly significant and potentially misleading if misinterpreted. While some investigators saw it as supporting the wandering hypothesis, suggesting Betty might have changed route out of curiosity or gotten caught up in some random activity, others began noticing inconsistencies between the item's location and the girl's usual behavior, especially considering her age and the limits the Sanchez family had set on her movements. The contradiction between the evidence and the initial hypothesis became increasingly clear as routes were more thoroughly checked without finding signs that Betty continued moving alone after the discovery point. No footprints, no additional witnesses, no evidence she left the area in another direction. The absence of these signs forced the team to consider the possibility that Betty's journey was interrupted at or near that location, a possibility not fully fitting the prolonged wandering scenario they prioritized, but not strong enough to immediately shift focus to another investigative direction. Under pressure to make decisions, investigators made the first adjustment to the direction, not by completely abandoning the initial hypothesis, but by expanding the scope to include situations previously deemed unlikely, while requesting re-examination of statements related to the evidence discovery area for any overlooked details. This adjustment was cautious and gradual, reflecting hesitation in breaking the established thinking framework from the investigation's first hours, but it also marked the point where Betty Sanchez's disappearance could no longer be explained simply as an ordinary wandering incident. In that context, The crime scene was no longer just a collection of physical locations to check, but became a space containing unanswered questions, where every small detail could change the entire case's perception, and where the only found evidence served both as a valuable clue and the source of growing doubts about the hypothesis chosen from the start. After the crime scene no longer provided additional physical evidence clear enough to definitively guide the investigation, the focus of the inquiry was forced to shift to people, specifically, identifying and systematizing all individuals who might have seen, interacted with, or been indirectly connected to Betty Sanchez in the period before and immediately after her disappearance, a process that seemed straightforward in a small community, but quickly revealed considerable complexity, as the boundary between direct and indirect witnesses proved far from clear. The initial witness list included residents of the Sanchez family's neighborhood, Betty's peers, adults who frequently visited the children's play areas, along with individuals mentioned in the family's accounts, and the last witnesses to have contact with the girl, and over time, this list continued to expand, as new names were added based on seemingly minor details, such as a person passing through the street, a mobile vendor, or an individual only briefly mentioned in an informal conversation. The interrogation process took place in multiple rounds, starting with the witnesses considered most reliable, those with close ties to the Sanchez family, or present in the area at the critical time, with the goal of gathering detailed statements about what they had seen, heard, or inferred, while establishing specific timelines for cross-referencing. However, from the very first interrogation sessions, differences in the statements became evident, not only in minor details like times or directions of movement, but also in how each witness interpreted the same event, reflecting a mixture of actual memory and assumptions formed after learning that Betty had gone missing. Comparing the statements revealed that some witnesses remembered unrelated details very clearly, while being vague or contradictory about elements that could potentially be decisive, a common phenomenon, but particularly dangerous in the early stage of an investigation, when every piece of information could influence the overall direction. When the statements were placed side by side, contradictions began to emerge in unpredictable ways. In some cases, the same witness changed their account between interrogations. In others, multiple witnesses provided entirely different descriptions of the same person or situation, forcing the investigative team to confront the question of whether this was the result of faulty memory or a sign of concealed information. Memory distortion became a central factor to evaluate, as most witnesses were unaware at the time that they were observing moments that might later become significant, leading the brain to not record details systematically, especially in the context of routine daily activities considered safe and familiar. Psychological pressure from being questioned, from community attention, and from the fear of having missed something important further exacerbated the inconsistency in statements, as some witnesses unconsciously adjusted their stories to align with what they thought investigators were looking for, or with information already circulating in the community. Faced with this overlapping mass of information, the investigative team was compelled to screen, categorize, and assess the reliability of each statement based on internal consistency, compatibility with the physical evidence already collected, and the possibility of independent verification, a process both necessary and risky, since dismissing a statement meant accepting that the information lacked investigative value at that moment. In this process, some statements initially deemed important were discarded because they could not be confirmed, or because they contradicted other data too greatly, including accounts from witnesses once considered reliable, a pragmatic decision in the context of needing to narrow the scope of the investigation, but one that carried the risk of overlooking key clues. The discarding of these statements was not arbitrary, but based on clear criteria of consistency and verifiability. However, it also reflected the limitations of investigative methods of that era, when modern tools for assessing memory accuracy or objectively reconstructing contexts were not yet available. The direct consequence of inconsistent information was the gradual blurring of the event timeline, making it increasingly difficult to pinpoint the exact minutes or hours before Betty disappeared, while creating gaps that no hypothesis could convincingly fill. As investigators tried to connect the remaining pieces of information, they realized that each contradiction was not just an isolated issue, but had a ripple effect on the entire structure of the investigation, weakening the ability to establish a clear direction and forcing greater reliance on assumptions rather than solid facts. In that context, witnesses were no longer merely sources of information, but became a volatile factor, capable of either bringing a breakthrough or derailing the investigative effort, and it was this instability that laid the groundwork for the difficult decisions to come, as the team had to weigh whether to continue digging into uncertain statements or accept that, at this stage, the truth about what happened to Betty Sanchez remained obscured by layers of distorted memories, unresolved contradictions, and choices forced by the lack of reliable information. The disorder in the system of statements, and the increasingly difficult-to-fill gaps from witnesses, forced the investigative team to re-examine the foundation of the entire reasoning being used, thereby raising the decisive question of whether Betty Sanchez's disappearance truly stemmed from a spontaneous act by a child, or whether there had been intervention by another individual that diverted the chain of events in a completely different direction. Evaluating the possibility that Betty did not leave on her own was conducted by cross-referencing all collected data with what was known about her behavior, daily boundaries, and social relationships, notably highlighting the absence of any signs that Betty had ever tended to stray far from familiar areas for extended periods, or had a motive to do so. Investigators noted that, within the long-established framework of her routine, Betty had no precedent for leaving on her own, no family conflicts or personal concerns significant enough to prompt runaway behavior, and no evidence that she had prepared for a voluntary departure, even a short one. When these factors were placed alongside the location of the discovered physical evidence and the lack of subsequent traces of movement, the scenario of Betty leaving the area voluntarily became less convincing, creating space for a more serious alternative hypothesis to be considered systematically. From there, the abduction hypothesis began to take shape as an explanation capable of connecting many disparate pieces of the case, particularly the possibility that Betty had been approached by someone else and left the area in a short window of time, too brief to draw attention or leave clear signs of violence. This hypothesis fit the social context where children were taught to trust and obey adults, while reflecting the reality that the assumed safety of the community could create blind spots in perception, allowing unusual behavior to be easily overlooked or interpreted as harmless. However, bringing the abduction hypothesis to the discussion table quickly exposed deep disagreements within the investigative team, as it was not just a professional choice, but an implicit declaration about the severity of the case and the responsibility of authorities in protecting the community. One group of investigators argued that the contradictions in statements, the mismatch between physical evidence and the lost child hypothesis, and the absence of signs of voluntary movement, all indicated that the abduction hypothesis should be prioritized to avoid missing a deliberate criminal scenario, while others worried that shifting focus too early to such a direction would waste limited resources, cause panic in the community, and rely too heavily on speculation in the absence of direct evidence. This debate unfolded amid pressure to make quick decisions, as each passing hour reduced the chances of gathering new information, but also increased the risk of biased choices based on subjective feelings rather than verifiable data. Ultimately, weighing these factors led to a compromise decision, in which the abduction hypothesis was neither completely discarded nor placed at the center of the investigation, but instead retained as a secondary possibility, awaiting clearer evidence to be fully activated. The decision not to focus on the abduction hypothesis was justified by the argument that in the current context, prioritizing less serious scenarios allowed for maintaining community stability and rational resource use, while avoiding expanding the investigative scope beyond control when no specific signs necessitated that direction. However, this choice also carried consequences not immediately apparent, as it directly influenced how any new clues, if they emerged, would be received and interpreted within the established framework of assumptions. When the abduction hypothesis was not prioritized, proactive investigative activities, such as screening individuals with histories of approaching unfamiliar children, checking exit routes from the area, or early coordination with other investigative units, were not implemented to the necessary degree, causing the scope of consideration to gradually narrow around the initial assumptions. In the long term, this choice created an investigative trajectory difficult to alter, in which each subsequent decision was built on the foundation of the hypothesis that Betty's disappearance did not stem from an organized abduction, reducing the ability to identify and pursue more serious scenarios, even as contradictory signs continued to accumulate. The long-term consequences of not focusing on the abduction hypothesis could not be measured at the moment the decision was made, but it silently shaped how the case was perceived, handled, and prioritized in subsequent stages, as every new investigative effort had to operate within the limits of the accepted assumptions, making the chances of reaching the truth about what happened to Betty Sanchez increasingly fragile over time. The choice not to place the abduction hypothesis at the center caused the suspect narrowing activities to proceed within a narrower mindset than the potential severity of the case warranted, as the investigative team prioritized screening individuals familiar with the Sanchez family and the surrounding community, before broadening attention to strangers who only briefly appeared in the area. Identifying potential suspects began with those who had direct or indirect connections to Betty, including relatives, neighbors, acquaintances who regularly visited the neighborhood, as well as individuals who had opportunities to interact with children in the community, under the assumption that if wrongdoing occurred, it was most likely from an existing relationship. In parallel, a list of strangers present in the area on the day Betty disappeared was compiled based on witness statements and scattered records, but due to incomplete and inconsistent information, this group quickly faded in the overall investigative picture. The screening of known individuals was thorough but also influenced by invisible biases, as in a small community, suspecting those regarded as good acquaintances often met subtle resistance, both from the community and from the investigators themselves, who were part of that social environment. Strangers, meanwhile, were examined through a lens lacking data, with no complete profiles, no certain witnesses, and no clear signs of suspicious direct interaction with Betty, making their inclusion on the suspect list more formal than strategic. In that context, a primary suspect gradually emerged, not because of compelling evidence, but due to a combination of indirect factors, such as unusual behavior, vague history, or simple coincidence of time and place, enough to draw the attention of a team needing a specific direction. Pursuing this suspect became the focus of investigative efforts for a considerable period, with activities verifying background, gathering additional statements, and searching for links that could connect the individual to Betty's disappearance. However, despite the increasing attention given to the primary suspect, what was gathered remained at the level of suspicion, with no direct physical evidence, no witnesses confirming wrongdoing, and no clear connection strong enough to meet the legal threshold required for prosecution. The lack of prosecutable evidence was not just a technical obstacle, but reflected the consequences of an investigation guided by the initial assumption that the case did not involve organized crime, causing many possibilities, requiring deeper checks to not be pursued in time. While the primary suspect was repeatedly monitored and checked without yielding a breakthrough, other investigative directions were gradually neglected or only superficially examined, creating an imbalance in resource allocation. Over-focusing on one specific individual, in the absence of corroborating evidence, inadvertently weakened the ability to view the case comprehensively as every new clue was interpreted in terms of reinforcing or refuting suspicion around this suspect, rather than being evaluated independently. When efforts to prosecute could not advance further due to lack of legal basis, the investigative team found itself in a dilemma, unable either to completely clear the primary suspect due to unresolved suspicions, or to take stronger measures without violating legal standards and individual rights. In this state, the investigation began showing signs of being pulled in a wrong direction, where seeking confirmation for a formed hypothesis became more important than broadening the scope to explore other possibilities. This wrong direction did not stem from a single decision, but from a chain of smaller choices, each seeming reasonable in its own context, but together creating an inertia difficult to break, making the investigation increasingly dependent on initial assumptions and early identified subjects. Meanwhile, other individuals, both known and unknown, who might have appeared on the periphery of the investigative picture, but did not fit the pursued suspect profile, were gradually pushed out of view, not because they had been convincingly ruled out, but because they did not match the narrative the team was unconsciously building. This deviation was further reinforced by the pressure to demonstrate that investigative efforts were progressing, making continued pursuit of the primary suspect, even without breakthroughs, more acceptable than admitting the current direction might not lead to results. Over time, the lack of prosecutable evidence not only stalled the ability to handle the suspect, but also eroded the motivation to expand the investigation, as each failure to strengthen the case reinforced the feeling that the case was heading into a dead end. The investigation being pulled in the wrong direction in this sense was not complete neglect, but a misdirected focus, where energy, time, and resources were poured into efforts that did not offer the highest chance of reaching the truth, while other, less obvious, but potentially more important possibilities were not fully explored. The direct consequence of this situation was stagnation in the process of clarifying what happened to Betty Sanchez, as the investigation gradually lost the flexibility needed to adapt to contradictory data and unresolved gaps, causing every subsequent step to occur in the shadow of prior decisions, and increasingly difficult to reverse. The investigation's trajectory had been skewed by the prolonged focus on specific suspects, yet this did not halt search operations. On the contrary, it pressured authorities to expand the spatial scope of their sweeps in the hope that some overlooked trace, somewhere beyond the initial residential area, might provide the answers that other investigative avenues had failed to deliver. The search radius was systematically expanded, though more on a trial-and-error basis than grounded in verified data, starting from adjacent neighborhoods and gradually extending to suburban areas, open fields, vacant lots, forest edges, and the roads connecting the town to surrounding smaller communities, based on the assumption that if Betty had wandered off on her own or been taken out of the area, her traces were likely somewhere within this network of spaces. The routes checked included not only familiar pedestrian paths, but also lesser-traveled roads, temporary stopping points that might attract children, or spots where an adult could pause without drawing attention, reflecting an effort to cover every possibility amid a lack of clear leads. The rapid expansion of searches quickly required community involvement, as the local police force lacked the personnel to sustain large-scale sweeps over extended periods, leading to calls for volunteers, neighbors, scattered farmers around the town, and those familiar with the area's natural terrain. Search parties were formed, each assigned to a specific zone, walking for hours through varied landscapes, checking places where a child might hide, rest, or encounter danger, from small ditches to abandoned structures, while coordinating officers attempted to log results and avoid overlaps despite very limited management tools. The widespread community participation created a sense that all resources had been mobilized, but it also exposed organizational and technological limitations, as assignments relied mainly on paper maps, verbal directions, and personal memory, making it difficult to ensure every area was thoroughly covered. Support from nearby units was brought in to bolster manpower, but coordination remained localized, lacking a robust command center to integrate information from multiple sources, resulting in each labor-intensive search yielding only a disjointed collection of reports that failed to form a clear overall picture. The technological constraints of the era posed a major barrier, with no aerial surveillance, no real-time communication systems for progress updates, and no spatial data analysis to identify higher probability zones, leaving decisions on where to search next largely to intuition and experience, rather than scientific analysis. Dedicated manpower was also an issue, as participating officers still had to handle other routine duties, making sustained high-intensity efforts over consecutive days unsustainable, while volunteers, though enthusiastic, could not fully replace trained professionals. Through each search wave, results remained zero, no new physical evidence, no credible witnesses emerging, no signs that Betty had passed through or lingered in the newly checked areas, gradually eroding the initial belief that spatial expansion would yield a breakthrough. Internal reports began reflecting repetitive conclusions, as newly added search zones grew increasingly distant from the case's original context and lacked clear ties to collected data, heightening the sense that the search was being stretched without focus. In this context, frustration emerged not only within the investigation team but spread to the community and the Sanchez family, as each fruitless day diminished hopes of finding Betty safe and heightened psychological pressure on those directly involved. The lack of tangible results after multiple expansions forced investigators to confront the reality that a wide-area search campaign could not be maintained indefinitely, especially without new leads to justify further resource investment. Internal discussions increasingly revolved around weighing continued searches at reduced intensity against shifting focus to re-examining existing data, though either option carried a sense of helplessness for failing to provide concrete answers about Betty's fate. Investigative resources, already depleted by pursuing unproductive leads, continued to be drained by prolonged search campaigns, making allocation of personnel, time, and budget increasingly difficult, as authorities handled multiple community cases simultaneously. As priority for the search gradually diminished, not because the case was resolved, but due to dwindling prospects for new results, deadlock ceased to be temporary and became the defining feature of the entire process, marking the point where Betty Sanchez's disappearance began slipping from an urgent search into the realm of an unresolved case in the present. The prolonged deadlock in wide-area searches, coupled with no additional verified data emerging to open new approaches, left the entire investigation depleted of leads, in both physical and informational terms, as every reasonable location had been swept, every noted suspect monitored to permissible limits, and every collectible statement recorded, cross-checked, and filtered multiple times without breakthrough. In this context, internal reports grew more summative than updating, reflecting the reality that what remained were old data re-examined through the same lens that had yielded no results over time. Operational pressures on local authorities, who had to allocate resources across multiple tasks, began directly impacting the investigation's personnel structure, as key detectives long attached to the Betty Sanchez file were reassigned to other cases with higher urgency and resolution potential, meeting community needs and performance metrics. This reassignment was not abrupt or abandonment-like, but the result of gradual effectiveness evaluations, deeming the case past active investigation and no longer warranting high dedicated manpower. As investigators left the file, successors typically assumed passive maintenance and response roles for any new developments, rather than proactive pursuit or hypothesis development, diminishing case continuity and depth of understanding over time. Alongside personnel changes, the file's priority visibly dropped in case management, as periodic review meetings shifted focus to newer cases with fresh data and short-term resolution potential. Betty Sanchez's file remained technically open, but no longer high priority, meaning no proactive investigative resources, no periodic searches, and no further expansions as before. In this state, any new information would only receive reactive review based on specificity and verifiability, rather than integration into a comprehensive strategy as in early phases. Facing this reality, a procedural yet significant decision was made, archiving the case under protocols for stalled files, moving all documents, reports, statements, and evidence to official storage. This did not mean declaring the case solved or permanently closed, but acknowledging that with available tools, data, and resources, the investigation had reached its limits. Archiving included administrative notes on status, no final conclusion on disappearance cause, no prosecutable suspect, no evidence confirming death or survival, creating prolonged legal ambiguity. This status prevented classification as solved yet no longer as ongoing, existing in legal limbo where responsibility persisted but specific actions were strictly limited. For the Sanchez family, this shift felt like gradual silence from authorities, not disinterest but lack of specifics to update, making later contacts mostly confirmations of open status without progress. Institutionally, the ambiguous legal status imposed clear limits: no high-level missing person alerts, no formal interjurisdictional mechanisms, no special measures reserved for clear crime indications. Betty Sanchez's file thus became documents representing an unanswered question, preserved as unresolved but no longer qualifying for new action. This shift occurred gradually, through declining intensity, each priority reduction, personnel transfer, and fruitless report contributing to removing the case from central focus. When officially archived, Betty Sanchez's disappearance was no longer an emergency requiring immediate response, but a lingering question in storage, awaiting external factors, new information, or fundamental future changes strong enough to reactivate it from stasis, while active investigation had temporarily closed in the true sense of a cold case. The investigation file's stasis did not mean Betty Sanchez's story ended, for in a space entirely separate from the archiving system and recent administrative decisions, her life continued on a different trajectory, starting with her removal from the area where she grew up, without leaving traces clear enough to link to her old identity. This departure lacked the appearance of a prepared trip or purposeful move by the victim, but resulted from actions controlled by others, where Betty had no choice, no contact opportunity, and no say in her destination. Her removal from Montana occurred in a way that quickly erased her from familiar social networks, family, neighbors, indirect ties like school or neighborhood, creating complete rupture between past and present from the outset. Alongside spatial displacement came identity change, not merely using a different name, but restructuring all basic information tied to Betty's existence, including birth date, place, and personal details used for societal identification. The new identity was consistent enough for legal existence in another community, yet vague enough to prevent easy tracing back, forming a cover making Betty an individual outside ongoing Montana searches. In this context, the new guardian emerged centrally in maintaining the new identity, not just controlling living environment, but shaping Betty's self-understanding and surroundings. The guardian was not a traditional biological or legal caregiver, but one with near absolute control over information, memories, and relationships in this critical transition. Under this oversight, Betty was guided into a new life where the past was unmentioned, questions about family, origins, or departure reasons avoided or replaced with simple explanations acceptable to a child but insufficient for full understanding. Severing past ties was not a single act but prolonged, eliminating or blurring traces back to Betty Sanchez, no contact with old family, avoiding mentions of places, events, or people triggering memories. Each surfacing old memory fragment was blocked or reinterpreted within the new narrative Betty was required to believe, blurring boundaries between reality and retelling for her. Betty's existence in this phase was outside stored missing person files, as the new identity linked to no reports, mismatched search data, and had no clear intersections with collected information. In the new location's administrative systems, Betty existed independently with papers for basic social participation, but lacking origin details for backtracing, creating legal but invisible status to distant searches. Long-term living under different identity gradually shaped Betty's self-perception, as prior life memories did not fully vanish, but were pushed deeper, existing as disjointed fragments, lacking context and hard to name. Alienation emerged subtly through small moments, unanswered origin questions, unfillable memory gaps, inexplicable differences from others. Meanwhile, Montana's search system, limited by archived file and ambiguous status, had no mechanism to detect a Betty under different identity, allowing parallel realities without intersection. Betty grew up where new identity was taken for granted, but past severance meant no anchor for full self-understanding, creating persistent inner void unexplained by simple stories. The new guardian, controlling information and relations, not only protected new identity, but inadvertently or intentionally maintained separation from old life connections, widening distance yearly from the name Betty Sanchez in a dusty file. This existence outside missing records was not full freedom, but limited by unspoken things, past locked in silence, present built on incomplete information. Over time, new identity grew more familiar than old, not because truth changed, but because memories need nurturing to persist, and unmentioned, unconfirmed, disconnected ones fade, though never fully disappear. In this state, Betty existed complete biologically and socially, yet detached from her own history, living a life where her disappearance once alarmed a community, now an invisible void, unrecorded, unnamed, unlinked to long-halted searches, creating profound paradox between a dormant missing person file and a person continuing to live under a different identity that no one in the system ever questioned. Prolonged existence under a different identity not only created a distance between Betty and her past, but also gradually revealed signs of displacement within the very structure of her everyday life, starting with personal records that are considered the foundation for a person's lawful presence in society. The documents tied to Betty's new identity, while sufficient for her to engage in basic activities such as attending school, accessing healthcare, or working later on, were unusually minimalistic, lacking information that naturally accumulates over time, such as a clear residency history, continuous medical records, or administrative milestones verified by multiple independent sources. These gaps initially went unnoticed in an environment where the new identity was accepted as a given, but over the years, as procedures required increasingly detailed data, the deficiencies began to become apparent and hard to explain. One of the most prominent signs lay in the inconsistencies related to date of birth and origin, as this information did not always match across different documents, sometimes differing by just a few months, other times conflicting in year or location, creating small but persistent fractures in Betty's personal records. These discrepancies were not large enough to immediately raise official suspicion, but they repeated often enough to form a pattern, where foundational data seemed to have been adjusted to fit circumstances rather than reflect a consistent history. The lack of verifying documents exacerbated this situation, as many original papers that typically exist in parallel in administrative life could not be retrieved, or existed only as copies without clear sources for cross-reference, making any effort to confirm information reliant on the guardian's statements or secondary documents lacking sufficient reliability. In that environment, Betty grew up with a set of records sufficient to function in life, but not enough to create a sense of certainty about her own origins, as every question related to the past led to vague, ambiguous answers or complete avoidance. The gaps in origin existed not only on paper, but also permeated personal awareness, as Betty had no coherent memories of her early years, no consistently retold family stories, and no memory milestones confirmed by others to serve as anchors for identity formation. The fragmented memories, if they appeared, often lacked context and were not encouraged to be explored deeply, causing them to gradually recede or be interpreted in ways that fit the pre-established new identity narrative. Signs of concealment began to emerge not through a single action, but through a consistent chain of reactions whenever there was a risk of original details being questioned, from avoiding procedures requiring deep verification, limiting contact with individuals who could trace back information, to tightly controlling what Betty was allowed to know or ask about her past. The new guardian played a central role in maintaining this state, not only by providing selectively filtered information, but also by creating an environment where questioning origins was discouraged, though never openly prohibited. Over time, these signs of displacement did not erupt into a crisis, but silently accumulated, creating a feeling that Betty was always on the edge of the stories around her, present but not truly belonging, integrated but not fully complete. In social situations requiring sharing about family, background, or personal history, Betty often had to rely on pre-shaped information, even though she herself had no memories or internal evidence to confirm them, leading to a disconnect between what was said and internal feelings. This disconnect not only caused personal unease, but also created awkward moments when small details did not align, such as being unable to answer seemingly simple questions about hometown, early years, or connections to distant relatives. Meanwhile, the administrative system in which Betty lived continued to operate on the assumption that all provided information was valid, as there was no mechanism or incentive to delve deeply into a case that presented no obvious issues, allowing minor inconsistencies to be overlooked or explained as common administrative errors. It was precisely this combination of lacking verification documents, data contradictions, and memory gaps that created a strange state of existence, where Betty was fully present in social life yet detached from a solid historical foundation, making the new identity a shell that needed constant maintenance to cover unfillable voids. The concealed signs were not violent or overtly coercive, but manifested through subtle control over information and context, enough to keep everything running smoothly on the surface, but not enough to completely erase the smoldering questions beneath. As time passed, these signs of displacement did not vanish, but became a familiar part of inner life, leading Betty to gradually accept that some things about herself could not be fully explained, that her past existed as an unnamed void, and that continuing to live under the current identity required silent acceptance of contradictions, never clarified. In that state, Betty existed between two worlds, one of official papers and stories sufficient for societal recognition, and an inner world where questions about origins, true birth date, and reasons for information absence lingered, neither confirmed nor denied, creating a prolonged sense of displacement without a clear starting point, but also without any sign of ending. The sense of displacement formed from record gaps and simmering contradictions did not disappear as Betty entered adulthood. On the contrary, it quietly followed her into life's major choices, starting with education and career paths, where the new identity continued to function smoothly enough to allow progress, but not solidly enough to provide absolute peace of mind. In the school environment, Betty demonstrated good adaptability, completing academic requirements, and gradually building a stable, unremarkable image, avoiding drawing attention or posing questions beyond the norm, as keeping everything ordinary became the most effective survival strategy. Subsequent career choices reflected this tendency, prioritizing jobs requiring practical skills and stability over fields demanding deep checks into background, personal history, or family networks, thereby minimizing the risk of record contradictions being exposed. In her work life, Betty maintained the image of a reliable, hard-working and discreet person, enough to be recognized for competence, but not enough to spark curiosity about her past, a fragile but necessary balance to preserve outward calm. Building her own family came as the next step in that adult trajectory, as Betty established close relationships based more on the present than the past, choosing to share clearly defined parts of herself, while keeping the gaps as private, inaccessible zones. The new family provided her with a stable structure, where roles and responsibilities were defined by the present, helping reduce pressure to explain origins or personal history, but it also created situations forcing her to confront questions previously avoidable. In moments involving recounting childhood, talking about original family, or sharing early memories, Betty could often only provide fragmented information, lacking connections and sufficient detail to form a coherent story, reflecting the early formed state of discontinuous memory. These memories did not vanish entirely, but existed as scattered images, vague feelings, or emotional reactions unattached to specific narratives, sometimes leaving Betty confused by her own responses without being able to explain their causes. The memory discontinuity became clearer in unexpected situations, when a scent, sound, or familiar scene inadvertently evoked an unnamed sense of familiarity, only to be quickly overshadowed by the absence of specific information, creating an experience both intimate and alien. Abnormal reactions to certain place names were one of the clearest manifestations of this state, as names unconnected to current experiences triggered unexplained tension or restlessness, leading Betty to instinctively avoid or quickly redirect attention whenever they arose in conversation. These place names, though not consciously identified, carried an emotional weight disproportionate to surface knowledge, producing avoidance reflexes more instinctive than rational. Avoiding the past was not a one-time decision but a repeated behavior pattern over time, from not delving into unanswered questions to actively shaping personal narratives around what was safe and controllable. In family and social settings, Betty gradually learned to redirect conversations, blur details risking difficult questions, and keep her image tied to the present rather than history, as each touch on the past brought unease she lacked tools to handle. Avoidance became a self-protection mechanism, helping Betty maintain functional stability in daily life, but also reinforcing the distance between her current self and what had been severed from memory and records. In private moments, the sense of lack persisted, not as specific pain, but as an unnamed absence, while questions about herself remained silently present, though not openly asked. From the outside, Betty's adult life bore all the signs of moderate stability and success, with steady work, family, and social relationships, but beneath that surface lay a structure built around avoiding deeper memory layers, where contradictions about origins, birth date, and personal history remained as unverifiable blind spots. This avoidance did not make the past disappear, but merely pushed it into dormancy, where it continued influencing how Betty responded to the world without needing to appear as a complete story. In the flow of adult life, Betty learned to live with the gaps as if they were a normal part of herself, accepting that some things were unknown, and perhaps never to be clarified, as long as the present remained stable and undisturbed by unanswerable questions. It was this silent acceptance that allowed her to move forward, building and maintaining her life, but it also laid the foundation for an existence where identity was shaped more by what was avoided than by what was fully understood, making Betty's adult life a continuous balancing act between integrating into the present and keeping a safe distance from a past that remained, never named. Avoiding the past helped Betty maintain a superficially stable adult life, but it also made abnormalities in the new identity's legal foundation increasingly evident as they accumulated over years and began colliding with unavoidable administrative requirements. Betty's administrative records, when placed side by side over time, did not form a seamless chain like those of most individuals, but showed inexplicable contradictions across agencies, time periods, and document types, from initial residency registration to education, health, and employment-related papers. Some basic information was repeated mechanically without natural updates, while key milestones that should exist were entirely absent, creating the impression that records had been constructed to suffice for specific phases rather than reflect a continuously developing administrative history. Among these irregularities, documents related to adoption or legal guardianship stood out as a clear weakness, as they were incomplete by normal standards, lacking appendices, confirmation minutes, or evidence of a full legal process. These documents existed in fragmented form, inconsistent in format and content, sometimes mere copies of unclear origin, other times seemingly official papers that could not be traced back to the issuing agency. Upon close examination, these adoption papers showed no signs of a tightly supervised procedure, but resembled a minimal set of confirmations to legalize guardianship short-term, enough to pass surface checks, but insufficient to withstand deeper legal scrutiny. Signatures and endorsements in these records also bore unusual characteristics, not crude or obvious, but subtly inconsistent across documents, as the same individual or agency purportedly signing left marks that did not match in handwriting, signature placement, or stamping format. These discrepancies, if isolated, could be dismissed as routine administrative errors, but repeating across multiple documents, they began suggesting that the confirmation process had not followed standards, or had been intentionally altered. The absence of original data made these contradictions harder to resolve, as many key documents did not exist in archives at issuing agencies, or if they did, could not be accessed due to lost, destroyed, or never fully created records. The lack of originals meant verification efforts could only compare copies, creating a closed loop where documents validated each other without real anchoring to a reliable source. In this context, the possibility of forgery, though not immediately provable, emerged as a reasonable hypothesis to explain this whole riddled legal structure, not in the sense of crude fakes, but through sophisticated editing, addition, or reconstruction sufficient to pass routine administrative checks. This possibility required no complex network or high technology, especially in an era when interagency processes were loose and cross-verification unstandardized, allowing purposeful minor changes to persist undetected for long periods. These contradictory legal traces did not immediately disrupt Betty's life, as the system continued operating on the assumption that previously accepted papers were valid, but they created a fragile foundation where a single deep verification request or unexpected cross-check could put the entire structure under suspicion. In daily life, these irregularities manifested in small but persistent situations, like repeatedly explaining the same information to different agencies, certain procedures taking unusually long, or some data unverifiable despite existing on paper. These experiences reinforced the feeling that Betty's identity, though recognized on the surface, always faced the risk of scrutiny and questioning, making silence about the past an increasingly necessary strategy. From a legal perspective, these traces created a peculiar state where Betty existed in a lawful but not fully solid space, protected more by system inertia than record clarity, and where contradictions remained latent, due to lacking strong motive or reason for comprehensive review. It was the combination of contradictory administrative records, incomplete adoption papers, abnormal signatures and endorsements, and absent original data that formed a patchwork legal picture, sufficient for everyday life but inadequate under strict examination. In that state, forgery was no longer a remote hypothesis, but an increasingly convincing explanation for why Betty's new identity could exist smoothly for years without back-tracing, while also accounting for why questions about origins, background, and personal history always met a vague wall whenever seriously risked being raised. The institutional silence of a cold case file did not close the story for the Sanchez family, because for them, Betty's disappearance was not a past event, but a persistent void in their daily lives, forcing them to continue existing alongside it, even as the investigative system shifted to a state of passive waiting. In the early years after official search activities gradually wound down, the family maintained their own search efforts, no longer through large-scale sweeps or the constant presence of police, but through repeated, small-scale yet persistent actions, such as returning to places once connected to Betty, checking in with those who had participated in the initial searches, and staying in touch with anyone who might offer even the vaguest piece of information. Continuing the search became part of their routine, not with clear expectations of results, but as a way to resist the feeling that Betty was gradually being erased from reality, that if the family stopped acting, her disappearance would become permanent in a different sense, not just physically, but also in memory. Over the years, the Sanchez family maintained contact with authorities in various forms, from periodic phone calls to inquire about the file's status, letters sent to archival departments, to in-person visits to the local police office, to remind them that the case still had people who cared. These contacts rarely yielded new information, often limited to confirming that the file remained open with no progress, but for the family, maintaining communication held important symbolic meaning, as it kept Betty's name alive in the system, even minimally. Each time they received a procedural response, the family had to adjust their expectations, learning to accept the silence, not as rejection but as the normal state of a cold case, though that acceptance was never fully complete. In this process, the family also continually paid attention to information outside the official system, from newspaper articles and radio programs, to word-of-mouth stories about other missing children cases, because each case resolved after many years revived the question of whether something similar could happen with Betty. In retrospect, some leads had brought the family much closer to the truth than they realized at the time, such as reports of a child with similar appearance and age appearing in another state, or scattered stories about adoptions of unclear origin heard through distant social connections. However, in the absence of active investigative support, and without access to necessary databases, these leads often could not be fully verified, quickly falling into ambiguity, and ultimately left behind like many other possibilities that had appeared and then vanished. Each time, the family faced a mix of hope and disappointment upon realizing that the gap between knowing and proving was too wide for them to bridge alone. As time passed, it not only dimmed public attention, but also profoundly affected the structure of the Sanchez family itself, as members who had played central roles in the initial search efforts aged, their health declined, and their ability to continue pursuing the case was limited by the practical demands of life. Conversations about Betty, once urgent and painful, gradually shifted to a quieter state, where the loss was accepted as an inseparable part of the family, though never explained. In that process, the deaths of some relatives carried unanswered questions, creating particularly painful moments, when the family confronted the reality that some had passed without ever knowing what really happened to Betty. Each such passing was not just a personal loss, but also a loss of memory, as it took with it details, perceptions, and pieces of the story that no longer had a chance to be confirmed or added. Funerals, in that context, became milestones, reminding the family that the opportunity to find answers was narrowing, due to the very laws of life, where time waits for no one and favors no unresolved questions. Nonetheless, this loss did not cause the Sanchez family to abandon the effort entirely. On the contrary, it deepened the sense of responsibility among those remaining, to ensure Betty's story was not buried with the previous generation. The fact that the file remained open, even nominally, held special meaning for the family, as it preserved the possibility that one day, if new information emerged or conditions changed, the case could be re-examined without overcoming the legal barriers of a closed file. The family clung to this state as a form of institutionalized hope, where the file's existence, though silent, was proof that Betty had never been officially erased from the system. In family life, Betty's image was preserved through old photographs, remaining belongings, and stories, told and retold, not as a fixed ritual of grief, but as a way to maintain her presence in collective memory. Across generations, these stories were passed down with fewer details, but no less meaning, as they were not aimed at accurately reconstructing what happened, but at affirming that Betty remained part of the family, even though her absence had lasted decades. The Sanchez family's waiting, therefore, did not take the form of a continuous search campaign, but resembled a state of existence parallel to everyday life, where hope was adjusted so as not to become an unbearable burden, yet never fully extinguished. Each news story about old cases being solved, each account of missing persons found after many years, reignited the feeling that the same could still happen, that despite the passage of time, the truth might not be buried forever. In that state, the Sanchez family continued living between two opposing poles, one the reality of prolonged loss and unfillable voids, the other, the enduring belief that an open file meant Betty's story was not yet over. This parallelism shaped how the family endured over decades, keeping the pain from becoming complete despair, and allowing hope, however fragile, to persist as an undercurrent throughout their lives. The steady yet silent flow of waiting for the Sanchez family finally encountered an institutional shift when the law enforcement landscape changed over time, leading to adjustments in how authorities viewed and handled long cold cases. The policy change toward cold cases did not emerge as a response to Betty's case alone, but as the result of a broader self-assessment within the system, where an increasing number of unresolved files were re-evaluated with the understanding that lack of conclusion did not mean lack of opportunity, especially as professional standards, storage methods, and analytical capabilities had advanced significantly since the initial investigations. In that context, a program to review old files was implemented, focusing on unresolved child disappearances, with the goal not of immediately recreating the full investigation, but of assessing whether past decisions had been made under appropriate information and procedural conditions. Betty Sanchez's file, with its ambiguous legal status and prolonged but inconclusive investigative history, was included in the list for review, not due to a new lead, but because the file's structure revealed layers of decisions built upon one another, without ever having been systematically re-evaluated. The review process began by gathering all archived documents, from scene reports, witness statements, and search records to internal notes, reflecting debates and investigative choices in each phase, to create a comprehensive picture of how the case had been handled from start to when it became cold. When these documents were placed side by side chronologically, systemic errors gradually emerged, not as a single grave mistake, but as a series of small oversights, each seemingly reasonable in its own context, but collectively forming a misguided investigative trajectory that was hard to detect at the time. Some reports showed important information had been noted, but not followed up thoroughly. Some statements dismissed early without full explanatory documentation, and some key decisions made based on assumptions never independently verified. These findings were not intended to blame individuals, but to identify how the era's limitations, from technology and manpower to professional mindset, had shaped the investigation in certain directions and inadvertently created lasting blind spots. During the review, investigators noted that much information once considered secondary or insufficiently significant could now hold different meaning when viewed in a broader context, particularly data related to witnesses, physical evidence, and the initial search scope. Discovering systemic errors did not mean immediately identifying a new direction, but it provided grounds to question what had not been done or had been overlooked, thereby opening the possibility of re-evaluating hypotheses previously set aside. When these errors were compiled, a series of investigative gaps became clearer, including the lack of connections between disparate pieces of information, absence of cross-jurisdictional cross-checking, and insufficient deep verification of less common but serious possibilities. These gaps were not evidence for a specific scenario, but showed that the original investigation had been constrained by assumed frameworks and available resources, leaving some avenues unexplored. Recognizing these investigative gaps led to a significant shift in approach, moving from asking whether there were enough new leads to reopen the case to whether the old leads had been fully exploited. In that context, Betty Sanchez's file was no longer seen as a static set of documents reflecting a deadlocked case, but as an open structure with layers of information that could be reanalyzed under new standards and methods. The proposal to reopen the file did not stem from an immediate breakthrough discovery, but from the accumulation of assessments that the case met sufficient conditions for active reconsideration, including the seriousness of the disappearance, the prolonged lack of conclusion, and the existence of systemic errors that may have influenced the outcome. This proposal was framed as a cautious step, emphasizing that the goal was not to repeat past efforts, but to determine whether current tools, data, and approaches could provide new perspectives. Internally, proposing to reopen the file also involved practical considerations of resources, priorities, and expectations, as not every cold case could or should be reactivated, and selecting which ones required balancing past responsibility with present needs. Betty Sanchez's file, with its long history and signs that initial decisions may have restricted the investigative scope, was seen as representative of the new policy's goals, where looking back was not about correcting the past, but leveraging the present. When the file was removed from storage for this evaluation, it was no longer a symbol of prolonged helplessness, but became the object of a structured effort to better understand what had happened and what could still be done. The proposal to reopen the file, though not yet leading to specific investigative actions immediately, marked a fundamental change in the case's status, shifting it from stagnation to a state of pending activation, where gaps were clearly identified and systemic errors noted as points to address if the investigation continued. In that process, Betty Sanchez's file once again emerged from the shadows of storage, not due to a sudden lead, but thanks to a change in how the system viewed the value of revisiting the past to seek answers that earlier times could not or were not ready to access. The pending activation status of Betty Sanchez's file truly began to move when a new element emerged from outside traditional investigative processes, originating not from the scene or witnesses, but from the personal decision of remaining family members to submit DNA samples to civilian genetic genealogy databases, an action initially not aimed at directly reopening the case, but stemming from a desire to better understand family origins and reconnect blood ties, disrupted by years of loss. The relative submission of DNA samples occurred in a context where genetic analysis technology had become more widespread and accessible, allowing individuals to participate in large-scale comparison systems without going through official criminal investigation channels, creating a data space parallel to traditional legal systems. The Sanchez family members' DNA samples were processed and entered into the database, where they existed as anonymous information strings, awaiting potential matches with other samples collected from individuals with no clear prior connection to the case. In that context, a partial match appeared, not sufficient to identify a specific person, but enough to create a noteworthy genetic link between the Sanchez family and an individual outside all previous investigative assumptions. This result did not indicate a clear direct relationship, but showed a level of similarity consistent with more distant blood ties, sufficient to suggest that the Sanchez family bloodline continued to exist and connect to a living person, rather than ending in a tragic scenario, as many old hypotheses had implicitly assumed. This partial match immediately created a fundamental contradiction with the hypotheses that had shaped the file for decades, particularly the unspoken assumptions that Betty might not have survived, or had been cut off from any biological connection to her original family. The DNA data did not provide a direct answer to where Betty was, but shattered the foundation of previous passive conclusions, forcing those reviewing the file to acknowledge that some old assumptions no longer aligned with the biological reality reflected in the new data. This contradiction was not sensational or definitive, but appeared as a technically weighty question. If the DNA data was accurate, then the previously accepted timeline and scenario needed re-evaluation from the ground up. Given the significance of this discovery, Assessing the data's reliability became an unavoidable step, as a match, no matter how compelling, only held value if placed in a rigorous scientific context. Experts examined sample quality, database coverage, genetic similarity levels, and potential technical errors to determine whether the result was reliable enough to serve as a basis for further action. This evaluation was not about seeking confirmation of a desired narrative, but about ruling out random matches or misinterpretations, especially since civilian genealogy databases, while broad in scope, were not originally built for criminal investigative purposes. When analyses showed the match exceeded random thresholds and aligned with a genuine blood relationship, the DNA data began to be treated as a valid investigative lead, not because it solved the case on its own, but because it opened an entirely new approach, independent of the old file's limitations. At this point, Betty Sanchez's file, which had been in waiting status, was administratively reactivated, not through an immediate official reopening announcement, but by transferring the DNA data into internal evaluation processes to determine if the discovery justified allocating investigative resources. The reactivation occurred cautiously, as authorities were accustomed to handling promising but ultimately fruitless leads, and thus every step was carefully weighed to avoid repeating past mistakes. However, unlike previous leads based on accounts or speculation, DNA data carried biological objectivity independent of witness memory or social context, giving it particular weight in convincing the system that the case could not yet be considered permanently frozen. The emergence of genetic genealogy did not merely add a piece of information, but changed the entire view of the file, forcing reviewers to confront the possibility that what had been believed true for years might only reflect the tools and methods available at the time, not the ultimate truth. Reactivating the file, therefore, was not merely procedural but an acknowledgement that the investigation needed restructuring around a new data axis, where biology became the starting point rather than historical assumptions. In this process, the DNA data was integrated into the file as a central element, requiring careful protection, analysis, and cross-referencing, as any early errors could undermine its value and recreate the deadlock loop seen before. The appearance of genetic genealogy, therefore, did not resemble an instant resolution moment, but was more like turning on a new light in a room long accustomed to darkness, making previously obscured details visible, while also exposing more complex questions about connecting biological data to history, law, and identity. In that context, Betty Sanchez's file entered a new state, where past, present, and modern technology began to intersect, and where a partial DNA match alone was enough to break decades of silence, opening the possibility that a story thought frozen in storage could now be approached with tools the previous generation never had. The reactivation of the case file on the DNA database platform forced the team in charge to shift from traditional investigative thinking to a systematic genealogical analysis process, starting with reconstructing the Sanchez family tree in as much detail as possible, not limited to familiar direct relationships, but extending to collateral branches, maternal lines, and distant blood connections that had previously been considered irrelevant in the initial investigation context. This process required collecting, standardizing, and cross-referencing a vast array of scattered family data accumulated across generations, from birth records, marriage certificates, and immigration documents to other civil records, in order to create a genealogical structure broad enough to explain the emerging DNA matches. Analyzing the Sanchez family branches was not only aimed at identifying who might still be alive, but also at eliminating lines that had died out or could not produce a genetic connection consistent with the recorded match level, thereby avoiding unnecessary expansion of the investigation in fruitless directions. As the genealogical branches were mapped out and arranged chronologically, a complex picture gradually emerged, revealing the dispersal of family members across various geographic areas, reflecting waves of migration, intermarriage, and branching that had occurred over decades. Against this backdrop, genealogical data from the DNA database was carefully cross-referenced, not solely based on overall match strength, but also on the distribution patterns of gene segments, to determine the relative position of the unidentified individual within the Sanchez family tree. This cross-referencing allowed the dismissal of initial direct line hypotheses, instead directing attention to more complex relationships where the person being sought might not be a direct descendant of surviving relatives, but rather belong to a branch that had separated very early on. The elimination of incorrect possibilities occurred in parallel with building the family tree, as each scenario was tested for consistency in timing, geography, and biology, ensuring that no hypothesis was retained simply because it aligned with emotional expectations. Possibilities that failed to meet basic criteria, such as incompatible generational gaps or conflicts with verified historical data, were gradually eliminated, narrowing the search scope in a controlled manner. This narrowing did not happen quickly, but was the result of multiple rounds of iterative analysis, where even small adjustments in the genealogical tree could lead to re-evaluating the entire structure, ensuring no errors were overlooked. As the number of possibilities dwindled, analysts began to notice points of convergence where DNA data, genealogy, and personal history tended to intersect around a specific group of individuals who had never previously appeared in any investigative hypothesis. Identifying the matching individual was not done by seeking an immediate perfect match, but through assessing overall fit, including age, gender, life context, and the possibility of existing outside the missing person system for an extended period. The circled individual was not a clear name from the start, but a set of increasingly specific characteristics sufficient to distinguish from remaining possibilities, yet still requiring further verification in subsequent steps. In this phase, reconstructing the family tree served not only as a technical tool, but also as a bridge between biological data and human stories, as each genealogical branch represented a chain of lives, choices, and circumstances that may have contributed to a disappearance lasting decades. The combination of family branch analysis, genealogical data cross-referencing, elimination of incorrect possibilities, and narrowing the search scope gradually created a clearer trajectory for the investigation, shifting it from a vaguely expansive state to a focused approach where each advance was based on the convergence of multiple independent sources of information. As the matching individual began to emerge as a serious possibility, not due to a single detail, but because the entire data structure was gradually pointing to the same point, the Betty Sanchez case took an important step forward, from reactivation to the stage of preparing for real-world verification actions, where genealogical hypotheses would have to confront the actual lives of the people they were attempting to identify. The identification of a matching individual through genealogical analysis was not viewed as the endpoint of the reasoning process, but as a sufficiently convincing threshold for the Betty Sanchez file to be officially transferred to the cold case unit, marking a fundamental shift in how the case was approached after decades of stagnation. Unlike previous phases, when the investigation was dominated by time pressure and technological limitations, the cold case unit took over the file with the core mission of reviewing the entire process from a systemic perspective, treating every past decision as an assumption to be re-examined rather than a fixed conclusion. This handover triggered a large-scale restructuring of the file, in which all archived documents, from scene reports, interrogation transcripts, and internal notes to remaining physical evidence, were digitized, reorganized logically, and integrated with new findings related to DNA and genealogy, creating a unified platform for analysis. The cold case unit did not approach the case as a linear story that had already been told, but as a network of decisions, hypotheses, and gaps that needed to be dissected to understand why the truth had remained inaccessible for so long. On this basis, the investigative strategy was built along two parallel axes, one looking backward into the past, and one directed toward the present, with the goal of having these two lines of analysis continually cross-check and calibrate each other. On the past axis, investigators revisited all historical case data, not just to reread the content, but to analyze how information had been gathered, interpreted, and used in each phase, from the first hours after Betty's disappearance to when the file was archived. Reports were examined not only for content, but also for the context of their creation, who made decisions, based on what assumptions, and under what resource conditions, to identify points where investigative inertia, or societal pressure, may have influenced the overall direction. On the present axis, the cold case unit focused on verifying the individual identified through genealogy, comprehensively assessing legal identity, residence history, social context, and relationships, with the aim not of accusing or rushing to conclusions, but of determining the degree of alignment between biological data, administrative records, and the existing life story. Investigating along both axes simultaneously allowed the team to continually place new findings in historical context, while testing old assumptions with modern data, avoiding one line of analysis completely overpowering the other as had happened in the past. In this process, re-examining old witnesses became a key step, not with the expectation of obtaining entirely new statements, but to reassess the value and limitations of testimony that had once played a pivotal role. Some surviving witnesses were recontacted to confirm previously recorded details, while statements from deceased witnesses were reanalyzed through archived documents to better understand how they had been used to support or dismiss initial hypotheses. This process revealed that some testimony, once deemed contradictory or unreliable, may have been discarded too early, because it did not fit the prioritized investigative direction, while other statements, despite limited reliability, were accepted because they reinforced the dominant hypothesis at the time. Reviewing witnesses from this angle was not intended to alter historical truth, but to recognize how truth had been filtered through the lens of the investigative context. In parallel with witness review, initial hypotheses about Betty's disappearance were systematically re-evaluated, not just in terms of right or wrong, but in their ability to comprehensively explain the current data. Investigators reposed foundational questions, such as why the lost and wandering hypothesis once dominated, why the abduction possibility was not pursued to the end, and why some investigative directions were closed despite incomplete verification. This evaluation showed that many assumptions had formed under conditions of incomplete information, and were reinforced over time by subsequent decisions, creating a loop where the initial hypothesis became increasingly difficult to challenge. When old hypotheses were placed alongside genealogical data and new forensic traces, some scenarios once considered low probability began to show greater plausibility, while assumptions once seen as foundational revealed unavoidable contradictions. Faced with this reality, the cold case unit adjusted the investigative direction, not by completely erasing what had been done before, but by reordering priorities, based on the best explanation for both historical and current data. The new investigative direction was built as an open structure, allowing multiple analytical branches to exist in parallel and be verified independently, avoiding the entire effort being locked into a single scenario, as in the past. This adjustment also led to changes in resource allocation, with a significant portion dedicated to field verification, legal cross-checking, and collecting data related to the identified individual, while the remainder focused on completing the historical picture of the case by reconnecting scattered pieces of information. The process of reopening the investigation, therefore, was not a simple continuation of what had stopped, but an effort to redefine the central question of the case, shifting from seeking an answer that fit old assumptions to letting new data guide how questions were posed. In this context, the cold case unit acted as a corrective mechanism, ensuring the necessary caution for a decades-long investigation, while proactively breaking the inertia that had previously hampered the search for truth. Investigating the past and present in parallel, re-examining old witnesses, re-evaluating initial hypotheses, and adjusting investigative direction did not occur as separate steps, but intertwined continuously, creating a cycle where each new discovery had the potential to alter understanding of seemingly settled conclusions. As the Betty Sanchez file officially entered this reopening phase under such a framework, it was no longer a passive cold case awaiting a miracle, but became an active process where past errors were recognized as professional lessons, and where the possibility of reaching the truth for the first time in decades was placed on a more solid foundation, based on data, methods, and clarity that the previous generation of investigators had never had the conditions to possess. The investigative trajectory, adjusted and strengthened during the reopening phase, enabled the cold case unit to advance to the most sensitive step of the entire process, approaching the suspected individual identified through genealogical analysis, without disrupting their current life or compromising the legal integrity of the investigation. The approach was not conducted as a confrontation or interrogation, but constructed as a cautious contact process aimed at gathering initial confirmatory information and assessing willingness to cooperate, while avoiding causing alarm or triggering defensive reactions that could affect subsequent verification steps. The suspected individual, under their current identity, was not immediately informed of the full case context, but was provided only the minimum necessary information to explain the reason for contact, ensuring that all subsequent actions complied with current ethical and legal standards. During this approach, investigators focused on observing consistency between the provided personal information and previously collected data, from residence history and administrative documents to life details that might reflect a disrupted or reconstructed past. When suitable conditions were established, collecting a comparison DNA sample was proposed as part of the verification process, not coercively, but based on clearly recorded consent, to ensure the results had legal and scientific validity. Sample collection was conducted under strict standards, with a full chain of custody, to eliminate any possibility of cross-contamination, mix-up or disputes over sample origin, as any error at this stage could undermine the entire subsequent conclusion. The comparison DNA sample was processed independently and entered into data comparison with existing case samples, including those from Sanchez family relatives and prior genealogical data, to determine match levels across multiple dimensions. The comparison process focused not only on confirming direct blood relations, but also on analyzing detailed genetic markers to ensure the results reflected a biological connection consistent with the reconstructed family tree, ruling out random matches or misinterpretations. When preliminary results showed similarity, exceeding established statistical thresholds, the data was further cross-checked by independent laboratories to strengthen reliability and ensure no technical errors affected the conclusion. Throughout this process, investigators and forensic experts maintained a clear separation between scientific analysis and investigative interpretation, avoiding letting expectations or assumptions influence how data was read and used. In parallel with data comparison, legal evaluation was conducted to determine the implications of confirming identity in the context of a decades-old case, including reviewing individual rights, notification obligations, and necessary steps to formally record the conclusion without violating procedure. This evaluation also included reviewing administrative documents related to the suspected individual's current identity, preparing for the potential need to adjust or supplement information in the legal system if verification was confirmed. Legal questions revolved not only around who Betty Sanchez was, but also how the system would handle the parallel existence of two identities over a long period, ensuring that clarifying the truth did not cause unnecessary harm to those involved. When DNA comparison results reached a high level of certainty, and legal evaluations showed no significant barriers, the preparation of the conclusion was implemented as an important internal step, where all data was synthesized, final-checked, and placed in a tightly reasoned structure. This preparation was not aimed at immediate announcement, but at ensuring that when the conclusion was issued, it could withstand any scientific, legal, or ethical questions that might arise. Investigators reviewed the entire chain of events, from initial genealogical data to final comparison results, to confirm no links were missed or overinterpreted. At the same time, alternative scenarios were reconsidered one last time, not because they remained highly probable, but to ensure the conclusion resulted from comprehensive elimination rather than random convergence. In this context, identity verification was no longer a single technical step, but became the convergence point of the entire modern investigative process, where biological, genealogical, legal, and historical data were placed in a unified analytical framework. Conclusion preparation occurred in an atmosphere of extreme caution, as investigators were fully aware that this outcome would not only resolve a backlog file but also had the potential to alter the lives of those involved, from the suspected individual to the Sanchez family that had waited for decades. For this reason, every decision at this stage was weighed not only on the basis of right or wrong, but also on the system's long-term responsibility toward truth and people. When all necessary elements were in place, the Betty Sanchez file reached the boundary between investigation and confirmation, where identity was no longer a hypothesis to be tested, but a conclusion awaiting official recording, marking the moment when decades-long ambiguity began to give way to clarity, built on a solid scientific and legal foundation. The thorough scientific and legal preparation during the identity verification phase laid the groundwork for the cold case unit to reach an official investigation conclusion, a step that was not merely procedural, but carried historical weight for a case that had lingered in ambiguity for over 6 decades. This conclusion was not based on a single factor, but on the convergence of the entire chain of cross-verified evidence, including highly certain DNA comparison data, consistent alignment with the reconstructed family tree, and the systematic exclusion of potential errors that could lead to misidentification. In the internal conclusion document, the investigators clearly stated that the individual being verified under her current identity was indeed Betty Sanchez, who disappeared in Montana in 1956, while confirming that she was still alive, having existed continuously outside the missing persons records for decades. Confirming that Betty was alive was not presented as an emotional declaration, but was built as a rigorous argument, with each conclusion tied to specific verifiable data to ensure no room remained for reasonable doubt within modern legal and scientific frameworks. Once the investigation conclusion was finalized at the unit level, the next step was to update the case status in the case management system, shifting the matter from an unresolved missing person case to one where the victim's survival status had been determined. This update was not simply an administrative label change, but entailed adjusting the entire classification, storage, and referencing of the file in federal and state databases, ensuring that Betty Sanchez's name no longer appeared on lists of unresolved missing persons. The status update process was carried out cautiously and sequentially to prevent information leaks or misinterpretation before directly involved parties were officially notified. Alongside the technical update, investigators prepared a plan to notify the Sanchez family, fully aware that this moment held not only legal significance, but was a profound emotional event for those who had waited decades in uncertainty. The notification was not conducted through indirect channels or dry administrative documents, but was organized as a controlled approach process, prioritizing clarity, respect, and psychological support. Investigators carefully prepared the content to be conveyed, considering how to explain the conclusion in a way that was scientifically accurate, while avoiding shock or misunderstanding, especially given the family's history of repeated hope, followed by disappointment. When the Sanchez family was informed that Betty was alive, their initial reaction could not be encapsulated in a single emotion, but was a complex mix of shock, skepticism, relief, and a delayed form of pain over the lost time. Investigators took time to explain the verification process in detail, answer emerging questions, and provide necessary evidence so the family could gradually accept this truth as an established reality rather than a fragile possibility. In that moment, confirming Betty was alive not only closed a long chapter of uncertainty, but also opened a series of new questions about the years that had passed, the reasons for the disappearance, and the possibility of reconnecting what had been severed. However, at this stage, the cold case unit deliberately kept the focus on confirming the most basic truth, avoiding delving into subsequent implications before the family had time to process and stabilize emotionally. After notifying the family, subsequent internal preparations were implemented to ensure that all future actions, whether legal, administrative, or social support, were carried out within a clear and consistent framework. This preparation included reviewing the entire file to identify necessary updates, preparing explanatory documents for related agencies, and developing a coordination plan among different departments to handle the consequences arising from confirming identity after such a long period. Investigators also carefully considered the manner and timing of releasing information externally, recognizing that the case could attract significant public and media attention, which might add pressure to both the Sanchez family and Betty herself. In that context, confirming Betty was alive was treated as a milestone that needed tight management, not only to protect the file's integrity, but also to safeguard the privacy and psychological safety of those involved. At the system level, the official investigation conclusion also compelled authorities to re-examine how the case had been handled in the past, not to assign individual blame, but to document important professional lessons about the limitations of old methods and the potential of modern tools like genetic genealogy. Updating the file status from an unsolved disappearance to a case where the victim was confirmed alive had significance beyond a single case, as it demonstrated that files thought to be frozen could still be clarified when conditions changed. For the Sanchez family, this official notification did not immediately erase the pain of decades of waiting, but it ended the ambiguity that had haunted them for a lifetime, replacing it with a concrete, albeit complex and challenging, truth. Meanwhile, for the investigation system, confirming Betty was alive marked a clear shift from the verification phase to preparing for subsequent steps, where the focus was no longer on whether Betty was alive, but on how to handle the consequences of that truth in a humane, responsible, and legally appropriate manner. When the official investigation conclusion was recorded, the Betty Sanchez file emerged from its suspended state, between possibility and assumption, to become a case clearly determined in terms of survival, laying the foundation for subsequent decisions that the cold case unit and involved parties would face, while for the present, the focus remained on ensuring that the newly confirmed truth was fully, accurately, and controllably received. Confirming that Betty was alive, and officially recording it in the system, created the necessary but not sufficient conditions for proceeding to a meeting, as between legal truth and human contact lay a sensitive space that required maximum caution, starting with arranging the meeting in a way that minimized psychological trauma for all involved parties. The reunion was not viewed as a spontaneous or purely symbolic event, but as a carefully prepared process where every detail regarding timing, location, and form of contact had to be considered based on expert assessments of psychology, legality, and personal safety. Arranging the meeting took place after the involved parties were notified separately and given time to process the information, to avoid compressing emotions that could lead to uncontrollable reactions during direct confrontation. Participants in the meeting were limited, prioritizing the closest surviving blood relatives of the Sanchez family and Betty herself, along with the necessary presence of support representatives, such as psychologists or trained coordinators, to intervene if the situation exceeded the parties' self-regulation capacity. The decision not to expand the participant list from the outset reflected the understanding that a reunion after over 6 decades of separation could not be handled like an ordinary family gathering, but required a sufficiently private space for each person to react in their own way, without pressure from others' gazes or expectations. Beyond human factors, time and legal constraints also played a key role in shaping the meeting, as all activities had to comply with regulations regarding privacy, consent, and the duty to protect an individual who had lived under a different identity for a long time. The meeting was not prolonged excessively in the first instance, as experts recognized that the emotional intensity accumulated over decades could become overwhelming if not controlled, risking psychological harm rather than healing. These limits were not intended to hinder connection, but to create a safe framework for that connection to occur more sustainably in the future. When the meeting took place, what occurred could not be described as a perfect moment of joy or release, but as the collision of parallel realities that had existed for over half a century. For the Sanchez family, facing Betty was not just seeing a missing loved one, but confronting the passage of time, the years of searching, hope and loss that could never be reclaimed. For Betty, the meeting was equally complex, as people sharing blood but strangers in life experience represented a past she had never had the chance to fully understand. The immediate consequence of the reunion did not lie in instantly mending relationships, but in shattering the decades-long imagined states, on both sides, where images of each other had been built from memories, guesses, and wishes rather than reality. Following the first meeting, psychological reactions emerged in various directions, from relief at finally having an answer to confusion, and emptiness upon realizing that the truth did not bring the simple closure once imagined. The Sanchez family had to face the reality that Betty had lived a complete life outside their presence, while Betty had to process the sudden appearance of an original family with expectations, memories, and pain she had never shared. Legally and administratively, the reunion did not immediately alter identity status or past established obligations, as any adjustments required time, consent, and proper procedures, forcing the parties to accept that meeting again did not mean everything could return to as if no separation had occurred. In the hours and days immediately following the meeting, the clearest consequence was the change in how each person viewed their own story, as long-held assumptions had to give way to a more complex reality, where there were no clear boundaries between right and wrong, loss and existence. The reunion therefore did not emotionally close the case but marked the beginning of a new phase, where relationships had to be rebuilt from scratch in a context where time had changed everyone involved. However, within this time frame, the focus remained on ensuring the meeting occurred safely, controllably, and respectfully of individual boundaries, as any pressure to hasten healing could backfire. The immediate consequence of the reunion was not complete unification, but the opening of a door sealed for over 6 decades, allowing the parties to see each other for the first time in the same real space, albeit still unfamiliar and cautious. That moment, though not loud or dramatic, held deeper meaning than any prior statement or conclusion, as it shifted Betty Sanchez's story from a case resolved on paper to a living reality where real people confronted each other and had to learn to exist alongside the newly revealed truth. The opening of the reunion door did not mean all core questions of the case were answered, as alongside confirming Betty was alive, came the unavoidable need to revisit the question of who took her from her original life, and the chain of actions that caused a child to disappear from her family for over 6 decades. On the foundation of restructured data, investigators compiled all hypotheses related to the abductor, not to seek a dramatic resolution, but to determine what could reasonably be known within the limits of remaining evidence. Hypotheses were grouped based on the historical context of Betty's disappearance, including possibilities involving someone known to the family, a community member with access opportunity, or an outsider who exploited the open and unguarded social environment of that era. This compilation showed that many scenarios once seen as disconnected in the past could now be linked at a hypothetical level, but none had enough evidence to exceed speculation, especially with key witnesses deceased and physical traces no longer existing. When placing these hypotheses in the current context, the cold case unit had to confront the question of prosecutability, not only in identifying a potential perpetrator, but on legal and practical grounds for a case from the mid-20th century. Assessing prosecutability revealed numerous insurmountable barriers, from the lack of direct evidence admissible in court to the inability to ensure chain of custody integrity over such a long period. Even if a specific individual with high likelihood of involvement could be identified, proving criminal responsibility beyond reasonable doubt remained nearly impossible, as remaining statements were indirect and unverifiable independently. Statutes of limitations further narrowed the legal space, as many potential charges related to child abduction at that time did not have indefinite statutes like modern law, severely limiting or entirely eliminating prosecution possibilities. Beyond limitations periods, the absence of physical evidence was an unovercomable barrier, as anything once at the scene had been lost over time, not preserved to modern standards, and irreconstructible with current technology. This gap was not just missing physical items, but a lack of necessary context to interpret actions within contemporary legal frameworks, risking any attribution of responsibility, relying too heavily on inference rather than evidence. Investigators had to acknowledge unfillable gaps, not due to lack of will or capability, but because time had eroded the foundations needed for traditional justice to operate. Facing these limits was not surrender, but a realistic assessment of what the legal system could and could not do in a specific case, especially when priorities had shifted from punishment to confirming truth and protecting the living. In internal reports, the cold case unit clearly noted that while identifying Betty was a major achievement, it did not automatically enable criminal prosecution of the initial disappearance's cause, as the two goals operated under different legal logics. Acknowledging unfilled gaps did not diminish the investigation's value, but placed it in a more honest context, where justice is not always achieved through a verdict. For the Sanchez family, the inability to identify or prosecute the perpetrator might bring a sense of incompleteness, but it also helped them understand that prolonged silence was not due to neglect, but objective limits no investigation could overcome after so many years. For Betty, the lack of a clear conclusion about who took her from her original life posed deeper personal questions than legal ones, as criminal justice does not necessarily align with an individual's need to understand and close a story lived under a different identity. Compiling hypotheses and assessing justice limits, therefore, aimed not for a perfect ending, but to define the final boundary of what could be done under current law. As investigators noted that some questions would remain officially unanswered forever, they simultaneously affirmed that clarifying Betty's fate and returning her to her original family was another form of justice, measured not by sentences but by truth. In that context, justice limits were not failure, but a reminder that the legal system operates within time, and when too much time passes, what remains is not always suited to punitive tools, but still holds profound value in recognition, acknowledgement, and learning. Closing the perpetrator investigation, though without a clear criminal conclusion, allowed the Betty Sanchez case to be viewed as one where truth was ultimately brought to light to the maximum possible extent, even if some darkness remained, not from lack of effort, but from gaps time created, that no means could fill. Acknowledging the insurmountable limits of criminal justice laid the foundation for the final step in the process spanning over 6 decades, as the official investigation reached a decision to conclude within the current legal framework, not because all questions had perfect answers, but because the remaining achievable core objectives had been fully and responsibly completed. Closing the investigation in this case did not mean abandonment, but recognition that further efforts, if continued, would not yield new evidentiary or factual value, while risking unnecessary harm to those involved by prolonging waiting and uncertainty. The Cold Case Unit, after compiling all verification results, legal analysis, and human impact assessments, prepared the final report, affirming that the goal of determining Betty Sanchez's fate had been achieved, that the victim was alive, and identity confirmed by modern scientific and legal standards. On that basis, the decision to close the cold case file was made as a necessary procedural step to reflect the case's new status in the system, shifting it from an unresolved disappearance to one fundamentally clarified. Closing the file did not erase the case's history or deny past efforts, but was the most accurate update of the current status, ensuring the file was archived with complete conclusions, documents, and context for future reference, research, and lessons learned. In the closure report, investigators devoted significant space to summarizing investigative lessons from the entire process, starting from how initial assumptions shaped the investigation's trajectory, to how technological, resource, and professional mindset limitations in each era created prolonged blind spots. A core lesson noted was the importance of keeping hypotheses challengeable, avoiding a single direction becoming an unchanging template that prematurely dismissed other possibilities. Additionally, the file highlighted the value of systematic data preservation and organization, as information seemingly minor or secondary initially could become pivotal when re-examined in new context. Applying genetic genealogy was identified as a methodological turning point, proving modern tools could open paths to truth even when traditional clues were exhausted, while emphasizing the need for flexible connections between criminal investigation systems and civil data sources within appropriate legal frameworks. However, the report also warned of these tools' ethical and legal limits, affirming that technology cannot fully replace caution and responsibility in protecting individuals' privacy and dignity. The long-term impact of closing the Betty Sanchez file was viewed at multiple levels, from individual and family to the broader investigation system. For the Sanchez family, officially closing the file brought a form of closure they had awaited for decades, not because all pain was erased, but because ambiguity ended, replaced by a concrete though complex truth. Knowing Betty was alive, despite losing most shared lifetime, allowed the family to redefine their story, shifting from hopeless waiting to adapting to a new reality, where memories and present must coexist. For Betty herself, closing the cold case marked the end of a historical chapter she never actively participated in, but that profoundly shaped her life, opening possibilities for a future no longer overshadowed by missing person status in official systems. On a broader level, this case left lasting impact on how law enforcement views and handles backlog files, affirming that reopening and closing files is not just administrative, but a process requiring balance between truth, justice, and human impact. It showed that investigation success is not always measured by court appearances, but sometimes by restoring identity, history, and presence to a person erased from others' lives for too long. The closure report also emphasized that each clarified cold case, even if incomplete criminally, contributes to reinforcing trust, that the system can self-examine, learn, and adapt rather than accept impotence as permanent. Archiving the Betty Sanchez file after closure was not silent storage, but as a complete reference document, clearly marked with steps taken, limits encountered, and lessons drawn, to serve training, research, and improved investigative practice in the future. In that sense, closing the file was not the story's end, but a transformation from an ongoing investigation to a case understood and recorded to the maximum possible extent. When the Betty Sanchez file was officially closed, it carried a long-term message that time can obscure evidence and fade memories, but does not necessarily eliminate the ability to seek truth if the system is willing to re-examine itself and responsibly use new tools. This closure, though imperfect, represented a rare form of completion in the world of backlog cases, where truth was ultimately brought to light enough to end prolonged waiting and allow all involved to move to the next phase of life with clearer understanding of the past. The story of Betty Sanchez is not just an old case from Montana in 1956, but a clear mirror reflecting life in America today. We still live in seemingly safe communities, still tend to trust acquaintances, and still easily overlook small signals, thinking bad things won't happen to us. In Part 1, the tragedy began from everyday things: a peaceful town, a family, trusting the community, a familiar witness as the last contact with Betty, but not alert to unusual factors. The practical lesson here is to make safety a process, not a feeling with children. Agree on who is allowed to pick up drop-off, family passwords, and the rule: don't go with adults without confirmation, even if it's someone known. In Parts 2, 7, the investigation was slow and misdirected, the wandered-off hypothesis chosen early, search scope expanded by intuition, resources drawn to a key suspect, but lacking evidence. The lesson for modern life is: in crisis, don't let emotions or biases lead. Record timelines, preserve scenes, report as soon as possible, and protect data, home cameras, phones, location history, to avoid losing evidence over time. In Parts 15, 18, genetic genealogy became the turning point, because the family proactively provided samples, and the system utilized new data. This suggests a very American choice today: use technology responsibly, keep family records, important documents, and if using DNA services, understand privacy. Consider sharing data when it benefits safety or justice. Finally, Part 21 reminds that sometimes criminal justice is no longer feasible due to statutes and lack of evidence, but justice of truth still has value. The Sanchez family didn't give up, the file stayed open, and truth eventually found its way back. If the story of Betty Sanchez makes you think about the fragility of safety and the power of truth after decades of silence, please subscribe to the channel to join us in continuing to follow cold cases seemingly buried by time. Thank you for staying until the end, and see you in the next video, where each story is not just a case, but a reminder that truth sometimes just waits to be heard.